Well, evening, Owen. So people will jump on most likely. It's usually what happens. So I'm just going to go because in the interest of time, I've got stuff I need to do. Uh, Proposal deadline tonight, so I need to get on that. So basically, this one tonight is something I've been working on for a long time, or at least interested in a long time. And then 7:40. Okay, we'll be done before 7:40. So this is stuff, ecological design, I got onto this was probably in the early 90s, something like that, probably 94, 5, and then just have been hooked on it ever since. So what the root of it is combining ecology and design. Now some would differ in their perception of what it means and so forth, but I like to take the purist approach, which is philosophically, what does this mean? So it's a combination of design and ecology. Nuts and bolts of it start with a basic definition. So you need to really understand what ecology is, and we need to really understand or define what we think design is, and then map those together to come up with certain applications. Now, ecology, you probably know this, but the Latin root is oikos, or home, and logos, meaning study of. So therefore, really what ecology ultimately means is the study of our home. And in this case, global ecosystems can be thought of as our home. It's a little more complicated than that. Ecosystems are, as you know, pretty complicated things. And there's a lot of moving parts, a lot of ways to think about those moving parts. And ecologists get in fights over this all the time in papers and so forth. I've seen it firsthand. Not physical altercations, but just debates and fights over what's what. And population ecologists always tend to migrate towards species interactions and populations being the most important factor in any ecosystem, at least in terms of the dynamics. And to some degree, they're right in certain respects. Whereas ecosystem ecologists tend to look at the whole system dynamics and tend to be a little more focused on some of the things such as energy, water, and the mechanics of it. I'm trained as an ecosystem ecologist. However, I'm open to a lot of different perspectives on things. H.T. Odum is one of the most noted early ecosystem ecologists. Him and his brother, I think, Eugene Odum, were influential in the world of ecosystem ecology. They basically wrote systems ecology, kind of not created the discipline, but at least definitely wrote almost the Bible for it. And they were ones that influenced guys like Buzz Holling and others that work on resilience to this day. So that's where a lot of influence came there. My prof was one of my supervisors was a student of H.T. Odum's. By taking such work and the patterns and processes it articulated, we can map them to other situations. So really understanding ecosystem ecology then can be mapped onto other processes and systems, and therefore we get things like the ecology of commerce, right? So that's a book by Paul Hawken that became quite popular. So this is an example of that kind of a system map or ecological ecosystem map, and you can see this is an H.T. Odum excerpt for Race Rocks and Victoria. So it gets complicated, but really at the nuts and bolts, what they're trying to do is map how this system, what are the components of the system, and how do those components interact, quite often with respect to the exchange of energy and materials. So in terms of design, two ways to look at it. Verb, it's the intentional action of planning the aesthetics and functions of objects, places, or processes. And the noun it's the representation of that action, so often initiated as a plan or a drawing. This is my design of an ecological building, and I'm engaging in design, incorporating ecological principles to do this building, just a verb versus a noun. So when you put them together, you get the intentional action of planning the aesthetics and functions of objects, places, or processes that incorporate characteristics of how ecosystems work. That's really kind of a definition of ecological design. It's really designing stuff, however, thinking about the characteristics of ecosystems and how they can be incorporated and mesh into that design. So, what are the luminaries and the not so lustrous folks in this field? How well have these ideas fared? This is what I like to look at. It's like, well, how have these things stood up, right? So we got to ask the question: who are the Sir Isaac Newton, the Marie Curie, the Einstein, the Descartes of ecological design? It's kind of hard to say, really, when you think about it, because We can identify both examples of successes. Hey, Adrian, how are you doing? We're going here, so I had to proceed. The question is, who are the Einsteins of this field? And then it's hard to pick because a lot of people don't even think about this stuff or don't know about it. It hasn't become that popular. I think it will, though. Personally, I think we're now entering the time where this is going to be probably one of the most important ideas around. But we can look at successes and failures of certain things and certain people, and then learn from what these have shown us. This is kind of what I have done in terms of choosing what to look at for work and then on projects. So some luminaries that I would say, these are people that I think are kind of, worth looking at to better understand how these ideas can actually work. So HT and Eugene Odom, it's good to look at their work as foundational. That way you'll understand what ecosystem ecology is, period, and then you can build off of that. William McDonough has been around for quite a while, and he's been on this beat for a long time, and he's considered to be one of the the authorities on this in the world, at least from an architectural and community standpoint. He's been a forward-thinking architect and community designer, and he just embodies this. So cradle-to-cradle design was really invented by William McDonough and his partner. And if you go to this website, McDonoughPartners.com, you will see the work that they're doing, and they're doing quite well now. They're doing a lot of good. They've got a lot of good mandates around the world, doing like headquarters for Google and stuff like this. But really, like tangible, practical stuff, Bill McDonough does. Norman Foster is another great example of someone who, I don't know if I'd say ecological design, but certainly takes environmental and ecological considerations into the work in a very, very big way, and a very significant way, like high quality. Norman Foster is like he is one of the leading, if not the leading architect working today in the world. And he's built a company that is just killing it across the board. And they always are very green in their thinking. And they think about these things. They think about some of these factors that other architects would not think about. So like the interaction of light and energy and so forth, and place in how you go about building something. Paul Hawkins, another one that's I would say a luminary, but more on the finance and business side. He wrote The Ecology of Commerce. It first came out in 1993, and that was perhaps one of the first books that really kind of like put it on the table. Now we have, like, quite often people will talk about the integration of ecology and or environment in the economy, but then it wasn't such a thing, and he started that debate in the popular sphere quite significantly. Another person I think is great to look at is Janine Benyus, who wrote this book called Biomimicry, Innovation Inspired by Nature. Very successful attempt at showing how ecological thinking can inspire great technological innovation. So how we look to ecology and nature, and then use those lessons to create technology that we can use, like looking at spider webs for tensile strength, right? Like that, in her book, I read that, and then I guess it was the late 90s or something like that. And very, very cool stuff she's doing, and she's kind of doing the same type of thing as William McDonough, like building out her thing as the biomimicry person. The last one here is an unknown, I would say, in popular culture, but like I love this guy's work. Like he is the one that jumps out. He is the luminary of all these people, in my humble opinion. Sim van der Rijn. So Sim van der Rijn wrote this book called Ecological Design, which I picked up in the early mid-90s. He's referred to as a philosopher, architect, and pioneer in the ecological design space, mostly as a designer, architect / community designer. And the book it's a must-read. It's called Ecological Design. Kind of like a little philosophical. Like, admittedly, it's a little like, oh, well, this kind of like esoteric, maybe you might say. But just obviously, when you read it, it's grounded in such commitment and knowledge to this idea, and that's what I love about it. And this is why I think Sim van der Rijn is like the understated. He's like the left winger. I don't know who to relate him in hockey, but he'd be like the underrated player that just gets it done. When the chips are down, they put the puck in the net. Like, excellent. Been at it for years before this was popular. And so Sim van der Rijn, check his book out if you can find it in a library or get it online. The not so lustrous, I don't want to name names here, but there have been instances when best intentions have not resulted in the best outcomes. Like people wanted to do, I want to build an ecological something or other, and then it just wasn't the right execution or right timing or right idea. A lot of it has to do with timing. So example that I'll call out is Earthships. I know some people love Earthships, but they haven't been the most successful of ecological design experiments. You know, a lot of them just have not worked that well. In principle, it's a great idea. So you're building into the earth and building like this earthen house. In practice, it doesn't work out a lot of the time, I found. You know, I've been to some Earthships that, you know, people hate them. Like some people just really don't like them. Like it's the darkness and stuff like that. So that's just one example where, you know, you'd think in principle this is a great idea, but it doesn't always work out that well. So how do we apply these concepts? Applications. Well, what I love about this idea is that there are pretty much infinite possibilities. You know, there's infinite ways that you can take this way of thinking about the world and then apply it. You can apply it, if you can assess any situation and look at it ecologically and even model it. But there's a few specific ones that I'll highlight tonight, and they are architecture, buildings that have ecological properties in their design, urban planning, cities that are conceived with functional ecology as a consideration, organizational and environmental management, so organizations such as companies that have ecological operational procedures, and lastly, technological systems, so integrating technologies together that work like components of ecosystems. So those are 4 different areas that I think are like practical, tangible things we can look at. So architecture is the most obvious one. So this is the most visible form of ecological design, I'd say, or one of them anyway, if you want to put urban design in there too. So we need to think about first how a building first integrates with its local surroundings. The number one thing you start with is how does this mesh with what's around us? So what is the local ecosystem it is positioned in? Like where are you going to put what you're building? What is the habitat it's impacting? What is the hydrological situation? What's the solar uptake? Basically, how does the building itself situate within the local ecosystem? How does it mesh with its surroundings? That's like looking at your project in the context or the biophysical context. You'd get at the stuff with an EIA if you're doing it, kind of like it basically you would, and if you want to do ecologically, then you need to think about different factors. Then we need to think about the building, consider the building itself. So things like how is energy used, how is water used, what is the impact of the materials that will be used. So like when you're going to design what you're designing, where are you going to get what you're going to get? Like we could get sourcing materials from all over the place. So what are the dynamics of the interactions of the building with, what are the dynamics of the interactions of the building with the immediate environment and the global environment? So when you're building it, how does it interact with the biodiversity around it and the habitat? How does it interact with the exchange of energy and water? So when you're starting a project like this, I suggest modeling it right away, like sitting down and drawing, this is where my structure is going to go, and this is where it's meshed in. It's going to fit within this ecosystem. So for instance, if we're looking at the sourcing materials, we may find out, and I've done this before for projects where we looked at getting materials from, you find out that your woods are coming from Canada, their metals are coming from China, the wall coverings are from Italy. We need to think about, and all of this together, you look at the kind of the life cycle of all your materials, you need to look at all that to understand the broad impact of the designs from source to sink. That's one of the considerations you need to make. So I'm not going to go into super great detail in any one of these. I'm going to stick some principles and then examples. And one of the ones that I think was, there's actually quite a lot of good ecological architecture examples or environmental architecture, but one of the most ecological ones that I've seen recently has been the work of a woman named Laura Hardy. She is from Indonesia, I think Bali. And I met her actually in 2 years ago at C2 Montreal, where I was doing a workshop or a master class on design, and then she was one of the presenters at the conference. And so she is a really nice person and does really neat work on designing bamboo buildings. So they've developed techniques for curving the bamboo and making it it's very strong, as bamboo has a strong tensile strength, and they are able to the bamboo and make structures such as you're seeing here. And the advantages of that is they're taking materials from their source, it really meshes with the local ecosystem right there. And what they're able to do with their construction techniques is do quite majestic structures. So if you go to ibuku.com, you can get more information about their process. They talk a lot about their process, like how they actually go about doing this, accessing and growing the bamboo, and then using it as a construction material. But really, I mean, a very good example of passive ecological design, taking materials from your local space or local environment and then using some creativity to create stuff like this, which is pretty remarkable if you see more of it. Urban planning. This is the other, what I consider to be main areas of, say, ecological design or ecological design thinking. And basically this is constructed or constitutes constructing our community dwellings in line with our surroundings. And it's been a challenge since we even started developing settlements. So once we started, just trying to figure out how to like work together, once we became less nomadic. Around 10,000 years ago, I'd say, when we started to do agriculture, this is really what kicked off developing settlements, because we were having to be situated in one place. Now with resources, at this era, with resources becoming more scarce and our populations continuing to grow, there is definitely a need now for what one could describe as ecological cities. Probably it's never been more important to have that, just because of the sheer impact that cities are having. So we need to understand the relationship between pattern and process, and this is a principle of landscape ecology. How we organize things will influence how they work, much like an ecosystem. So how an ecosystem is spatially organized, what is the pattern of its organization, will really dictate how resilient it is and also how it functions. Very similar to the design of an urban environment. Landscape ecology is something that I recommend looking towards when you're thinking about doing ecological design in the urban context. We should attempt to integrate the natural surroundings, and essentially, the core principle is attempt to integrate with the natural surroundings and minimize the impacts on the natural surroundings when doing this. We need to recognize biodiversity and ecosystem service resilience in the urban context. Now, I've talked a lot about this in other contexts, and it hasn't, I don't know, it's not happening as much as it should be, I think, right now. And I don't know why that is, but I definitely think this is an area that's ripe for a lot of work, is basically looking at urban environments and outlining what the impacts on ecosystem services are from that urban environment locally and globally, and then attempting to minimize them. I haven't seen a lot of work done in that area in research or in practice. There is a place in Indonesia that's doing some neat stuff, Bandung City, but in other cases not so much. We need to think, when we think practically, we need to think about things such as energy use, water use, and materials, and as much as possible promote reuse and recycling. So internal cycling of, say, water resources and energy resources and so forth. And so the whole idea of a net zero building or a net zero city, for example, is something I think people are talking about, definitely building. They're not talking, they're doing it. But I think that we will start to consider, hopefully, net zero cities, and then ideally regenerative cities. So we're not only having zero impact, we're actually regenerating global ecological or environmental degradation. That is, in my opinion, the goal. I think that you need to take a systems perspective is the first and most important step. Structure and behavior. So look at the structure of the key components. What is the structure of the urban environment? And then how do those things interact with one another? Define the components, determine the relationships, and then understand the function of those distinct components and then collectively as a whole. You need to think about scale in the urban context, both spatially and temporally. So, and also what are the connections across scales? Because we can, even in cities itself, the scale factor can be a huge consideration. If you look at, say, Vancouver versus Victoria versus, say, Istanbul, it's a totally different ballgame as you start to step up in scale. And an example of this would be, what are some of the connections across scale? So, for example, what are the local greenhouse gas impacts of, say, an urban environment, and how do those impact the globe, right? The other thing to consider is, how will the design evolve over time? So for one, in an urban environment, you tend to have development over time or growth, but you also have ecological change over time. Ecosystems develop and change. So you need to think about how will this impact the urban environment today and then over time. And this is very important to consider now, especially when we're looking at things such as sea level rise and distinct changes in the climate that may impact how cities need to be built out. Another thing to consider is whether or not it's an open or a closed system. And by this I'm meaning, is it self-contained, like there's no input or output from the outside of your system boundary, or is this where there's a free flow of energy and materials in and out? Usually these are open systems, right? Because you have energy coming in and materials and so forth coming in and out, but you need to like make that as understand that and build that in as one of your constraints when you're modeling it. Applying ecological principles will force us to look at the dynamics of our design internally as well as with the surrounding design, environment. So we'll really look at how does this thing work? What are some internal dynamics of the city, the urban environment, and then how do those dynamics interact with its immediate environment, and then up to scales. So a couple examples here are one example of a project and a person. I think smart cities are being talked about widely now, and that's great, but I also think it's not quite seldom will you hear about smart cities being ecological, right? I think the whole idea of a smart city can hopefully be co-opted to become a smart ecological city and bring ecological thinking into urban design more so. It already is, but even more so. There have been some tremendous successes in this ecological thinking in the urban context, but I would say more so on the specific project scale. So there's a lot of these kind of highlight projects, one of which is in New York City. It's called the Highland Project, in which they've made an urban park right through the city. I think that's a former either highway or a metro line. I forget what it was. But they've made that into a walking ecological path, which is great. And people just love it. You know, it's been hugely successful. So this kind of thinking was cultivated, not first, but certainly kind of popularized by a guy named Burle Marx in Brazil. So this guy was a landscape architect in Brazil. He worked a lot with Oscar Niemeyer, who, if you know architecture, Oscar Niemeyer is a very, very well-known Brazilian architect, fantastic designer. So they work closely together. So Burle Marx would do the landscapes and Oscar Niemeyer would do the buildings. And so he was commissioned to do the landscape design for Brasilia. They redesigned the capital of Brazil and called it Brasilia way back, I think it was in the 40s. So Oscar Niemeyer was hired to do all the architecture and Burle Marx did the landscape design. So here's a picture of him on the left, and then here's an example, not so much of his like ecological thinking. You can see there's some trees in the sidewalk. I just wanted to show some of the cool looking stuff this guy does. He's a real artist, and even that if you go to Copacabana in Brazil and look at the sidewalks, I mean, it's just all these patterns and design that he brought into urban design is just really, I mean, amazing stuff that he did, and really gave a lot of artistry to the trade, which has, you know, then evolved to this day. Now, organizational management is another area where we can apply ecological design. So I guess the question is there an ecological organization? Well, we have organizations that have environmental management systems. Some of you have studied this with me. It's like ISO 14001, for instance, is an example of an EMS standard. But an EMS is one form of assessing environmental parameters, but I guess, does it really constitute an ecological design? And I would have to say no. Like 9 times out of 10, it would be no. So in order to really do an ecological design in an organizational situation, you can't just look at, okay, well, what are environmental impacts and how do we measure it and estimate it? You have to think about how can we understand or even create ecological dynamics within this organization and understand them? How can we model our organization like an ecological system? So we need to really get at these kind of the system dynamics and functions in order to create or replicate ecological character in an organization. And there's only one example, I think, out there that explicitly and expressly states that it is doing it in like a real ecological way, and what I would say is an application of ecological design thinking, and that is the natural step. So is anybody familiar with the natural step? I've mentioned it before in other courses. I don't know if you've heard of it before. If you haven't, take a look at it. You know, it's a pretty neat standard or process. It's not I wouldn't call it a standard. I'd call it an approach. And they have a good presence in Canada. And what I like about the natural step is its roots, and it was rooted based on the understanding by a doctor who looked at a situation and said, "Look, we need to better manage ourselves." And he then developed this process or this model, a framework for organizing, for managing organizations, and called it the natural step. And he based it all on a cell, looking at how cells operate, and then tried to replicate that, because cells are extremely efficient at what they do in terms of managing energy and materials, and incredibly well-tuned machines. And so he took those and made a kind of a manifesto, I guess you could say, for this process or procedure. But then what he did, which was interesting, was he circulated through his colleagues and asked for input, and just basically had it destroyed. Like, people just laid into this and tried to kind of pick it apart, and he just powered through the feedback to get at what he felt was the most robust set of like procedures that could be then applied across the board. And his motivation was that, I believe it was children getting sick around a city that he was working in, and his motivation was to try and kind of reduce the health impacts of environmental degradation by creating this approach. Very noble. Check it out, Natural Step. And lastly, technological systems. So this relates to how do technologies fit together. Now, you know, you can think of this in a lot of different ways. Software and so forth, but I think the time has come for this. You know, this is a very interesting time now. Like integrated energy systems would be an example of this. So I guess the question I pose is, can this be done with ecological principles? Can you do an integrated energy system or an integrated transportation system and think about it ecologically? Yes, I believe you can. Now, something called the Internet of Things is hot now, IoT. This is what everybody's talking about in technology, one of the things. So this could present an opportunity to infuse ecological principles into technology design. This is what I think. In fact, this is what I'm trying to do in some respects. I mean, that's a bunch of research ready to go right there. But IoT, I think, presents us with an opportunity, because people are open to this idea, people are working on it, people are investing in it, and we just have to introduce ecological principles into the Internet of Things. How do these things fit together, and how does that relate to what kind of characteristics of ecosystems can we replicate in it? So to conclude, what are some common elements? First, I think, regardless of what you're doing, you need to use a systems perspective. You need to systematically analyze these problems, whether you're doing architecture, urban planning, technology, organizations, start with that. Secondly, look at the impacts from source to sink, cradle to cradle. So how do you connect these things? The impact of your design needs to be considered from what you're using from its very source all the way through to how it is treated at the end of its life. So we attempt to model the design problem in a systematic format and look at energy and materials flow. So energy and materials are one of the key things you need to consider in anything. And then think about the dynamics, the interactions and dynamics of the components. So how do these, you can say like, okay, we're doing an integrated energy system or something like this, and then we'll say, well, we have this, and this. You can like look at the components first, but then look at the dynamics of the interaction between the components. You need to like have a structure, and then you need to look at how those components work together, function together. I think regardless of what you're doing, you need to think about biodiversity and ecosystem services throughout the whole design process. So IoT and ecosystem services, that's an opportunity right there. Like it's waiting for someone to really dive into it and say, whoa, whoa, whoa. No, ecosystem or Internet of Things is fantastic, but how does that relate to ecosystem services? I haven't seen a lot of work in that area, and that needs to happen. So I think it'll be great as it starts to happen. And you also need to think about spatial and temporal scale. Very clearly, you need to think about that. And lastly, consider emergent properties. And we talked about this last time in the systems theory lecture. is think about how things do have emergent properties. And this is a hard thing to plan for, but just it's something to consider when you're going about doing these design projects, is that there most likely will be, if not always will be, some sort of emergent characters that it's the sum is greater, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. See what I'm saying? So think about emergent properties. It's hard to put your finger on what they might be, but they do exist, and they just kind of like emerge from what you're doing. Next steps. I see the next steps for this is in cities, smart cities. Bringing ecological design thinking to smart cities, I think, is an area that we need to look at, because that's where, in urban planning for sure. Architecture, I think we're good. I mean, I think there's more work that will happen there, but I think it's just on a good trajectory. We've got like a lot of good thinking going on. Maybe we'll get more, probably more living buildings and more regenerative architecture. I think that's probably the next step there, which I think could be great. Urban planning, I think we'll start to see, like I said, this whole advent of smart and connected cities, but make sure that we have ecological thinking built into that, like the ecological design of a smart city, I think would be something I'd like to see. Organizations, that needs a lot of work. You know, everybody kind of has we're having a hard time getting people to do environmental management systems well, never mind like bring ecological thinking into it. So I think we need to work a lot on that one. And then the last one in technological systems, IoT, it's a good example. Yeah, I don't know, I think it just needs to be, some work needs to be done there, and we need to show how that would work. What I would like to see is people like expressly articulating ecological design and integrated technology systems. Because always it's about the integration of the technology, and you never hear about any kind of ecology in this. Whereas I just want to see it more popularized. I like to see it become a thing, like a meme, you know, that'd be great. And I don't know how that will work. I think just talking about it and then doing it and making it cool, like doing it well. Quite often one of the weaknesses I have found, even in Sim van der Rijn's book, like although I love the book and I love what this guy's doing, it's not like your average person is not going to pick up that book and go, oh my God, my life just changed. You know, it's like just for people who work in, and so I hope that we can kind of reach those people and then just emancipate them, just make them go, oh my God, I never even thought about the world in this way. This is amazing. Let's go make this happen. You know, and there's certain things you have to do in order to make that switch turn on that a lot of those folks that are working in ecological design have failed to do, have failed to kind of like really kind of just make it so the communication's so engaging that people fall in love with what you're talking about. So I hope that we can do that with integrated technology systems, and then the other areas. Architecture, I think we're good, and we're going to move and do some more good stuff. But yeah, that's the area. Organizational design, that needs work. Integrated technology systems, that needs work. And then urban planning is pretty good, and then architecture is pretty good too. Those ones are more well established. So that's where the next steps I think are anyway, and where I kind of, when I get the chance to put my time into this stuff, that's where I tend to spend a lot of my effort. So yeah, that's my short rant on ecological design. I've included in this presentation some links that I think you would benefit from checking out, like Ibuku's, Laura Hardy's work is really quite cool. Very unique though, it's not like bamboo's growing all over the place. It's not something I'd recommend for Vancouver, definitely not. The amount of rain here would kind of just massacre a bamboo structure. So place-based design is an important thing to consider as well. Yeah, there we go. Anybody have any questions? Questions?
Yeah,
I can hear you.
no, it's just me, David. I turned on my microphone. That's all. I was just thinking about your blurb about the ecosystem services and the Internet of Things. It's
I don't know. I don't know. I haven't seen it yet. You know, I haven't seen anybody doing that. That is an idea right there. I mean, like, I think that's a $1 billion idea, frankly.
Yeah.
I've just given it away. Oh my God. No.
I don't think so.
Yeah.
I had bad things happen to me. I got offered a job today on Enbridge Line 3, and I don't really want to do it.
Oh, yeah.
So, yeah, depressing thinking about it. So, but I was kind of interested in your also the ecosystem services and urban planning.
Yes.
Because as you well know, maybe we have so many brownfield sites in cities these days. Drive around Edmonton here, you see them all over the place,
Yeah.
and there's opportunities there, but I don't think even the city of Edmonton, for all their vaunted supposed ecological and environmental kudos they've received over the years, they don't do anything about their brownfield sites too often, or they don't incorporate the idea of ecosystem services into these because they're all over the place. They're a fairly extensive piece of ground.
Yeah. Well, I haven't seen. I'm trying to think of a city that expressly does this, and I'm hard pressed to think of a place that does do it. Mind you, I've seen companies that do it. There's companies out there that are doing the corporate ecosystem valuation, which essentially is taking an ecosystem service framework and then mapping that to what your company's, the impacts of your company, both on the source and, like, say, where you source your stuff. Like, this is a lot of mining companies are doing this, and then what impacts are. So I don't see why you can't do that for a city. In fact, I'm going to make a note of this because this is, I know that the UN is interested in this as an idea. So the United Nations Convention for Biological Diversity, so the CBD, they're the ones that they're concerned with, or their kind of global political mandate is to promote conservation and sustainable use of ecosystems and biodiversity. And I know the people there, the Secretariat, are very interested in cities and biodiversity. And therefore, like, that's the time where you can say, hey, we should do a project and, I don't know, do a study at least on how this can work. So I know there's an appetite for it, but again, like that's like people that believe in this stuff and they work on this stuff, and then there's those that work in the city of Edmonton on a day-to-day basis, and they may not like that. This may not be priority number one for them.
No, but I look at you look at demographics and. By what is it, by 2100, something like 80% of the world's population will be living in urban environments.
Yes, that's it.
Or very close to an urban environment, and they're going to be a major player in how we use resources outside of cities too, right? So
yeah. Well, about it, they're like, I gave a TED talk on this a while ago, and I tried to frame it in such a way that people got it, and it's like the way I phrased it was that I view cities and big cities as nodes of resource consumption in the Earth system. So if you look at the Earth system, let's just look at the globe as a system, and like we do in Earth system science, and then you've got these dots all over the place, right? And those are just like sinks of energy and material use. Right? They just suck energy and suck materials. They just like devour trees and energy and electricity and all that kind of stuff. So we have to think about them in terms of these nodes of resource consumption, and then attempt to minimize that as much as possible. Otherwise, we're done. Like, I mean, seriously done. And I think I do see a lot of work happening in the area, but not revolutionary. Yeah.
No, this is actually something that really interests me as well as concerns me going forward from here. I look at things like urban sprawl, for instance, and not a block away from me, what was once, for the last 10 years, basically canola fields, is now they're putting up 2-story houses, and I'm going to be surrounded by houses here, brand new houses, and probably by the end of the summer. And they stripped it, and it's interesting too because you know how I feel about soil use. And I watch them strip soils from that site, and I watch them stockpile them, and I watch what they do with them, and it's actually pretty ugly. And these are this is a resort. These are large carbon sinks as well. They're pretty much gone. So, and now we're going to be a nice sealed environment over here.
Huh. Interesting. Okay, we've got some points coming in here from the text. Jane, how safe cities become to live in? Well, that's becoming an issue. It's becoming an issue in Vancouver, actually. It's getting a little crazy here sometimes. Jesse, I've had with cities in the Lower Mainland right now. It's cheaper to sprawl out than remediate brownfield sites. Yeah. The problem is the cities aren't accounting for. Yes. That's one of the things. Cities are not accounting for ecosystem services, and if we don't, I mean, first and foremost, account for them in terms of their impact, how you're impacting them, and then we can look at things like economic valuation and so forth, which take one step at a time. I think you freak people out when you talk about economic valuation and environmental services. But yeah, these are things that I think. I mean, we say they're a problem now, but I think a lot of people are aware of the fact that this is a problem. Most people I know recognize and are really increasingly concerned about unsustainable development in urban environments, and are thinking about ways that we can improve on that. So at least I'm optimistic about that, whereas it wasn't always the case.
Okay.
Yeah, but I think if you want to make this stuff really fly, and this is it, like Sim van der Rijn's book, Ecological Design, go and find that book and check it out. There's like a fraction of the population that has read or would look at that book, because it's not catering to that audience. It hasn't been like, it's not the Avengers, you know what I mean? Like, people love that shit, pardon my language. The book is Sim van der Rijn. In the presentation, the recording, SIM space van der Rijn is his name. He wrote a book called Ecological Design, which I recommend checking out. Sim van der Rijn is like the OG. He's the original gangster of ecological design. He's been at it for a long time, way before any of this kind of like sustainability stuff was popular, like 45 years ago. And him and William McDonough is pretty OG as well. He's been at it for a while. And then Alora's a new school person and so forth. But Sim van der Rijn's, yeah, I mean, it appeals to those that are like into that stuff, but it doesn't appeal to the masses. And I do think we have to make these things appeal to the masses, at least to some degree, if it's going to happen.
Okay.
Any other questions? And Adrian, I'll send you some material on the semiotic.
Okay, yeah, because you were going to send me that from your last lecture. I appreciate you allowing guests on this too, David.
No, more the merrier.
Yeah, I find this stuff. I'm learning to breathe it now. I love it. And
yeah, I just want to have a platform where we can discuss this stuff, and I'll share some ideas, and of course people will bring their perspectives. And I'll start to kind of make it a little more known. I don't mind if we could have 1,000 guests on here. I wouldn't care. You know what I mean? So, to see how it goes. I don't market this at all, but anyway, I think it's good to talk about this stuff. So there.
Well, yeah, no, and this is, for me, this is an introduction to a world that I'm not really familiar with. So, and now, and it's and it's actually right through the program, and then of course I've graduated already, but I find this is where I wanted to be 10 years ago, thinking about this kind of stuff, and I sort of sorry I waited so long. So,
well, you're thinking about it now, so there you go.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah, no, that's what And I look back on my work career based on this kind of thing, and boy, oh boy, I'm thinking, what the hell was I thinking?
Yeah,
Sometimes.
but at the same time, though, you gotta think about historical context, right? That you could
Yeah.
have started right in your earlier career, say, I want to be an ecological designer, and people would be like,
Yeah.
excuse me, like, where are you going to work? And because it wasn't ready at that time, I don't think the world wasn't ready for these ideas.
No, but I think you're quite right. It's becoming, especially if you look at it in a global context. For people in Alberta, sometimes you have to step out of your little Alberta oil patch bubble, like I had to do, and
Yeah.
and see what was actually helping and working where else in the world, anywhere else in the world, and it was an eye opener for me.
Oh, I mean, I've tried that before. I invited energy companies from Alberta to the COP conference for climate change in Paris, the Paris 2016 one. I
Yeah.
like had a and it was just so difficult to get anybody even remotely interested in that. And I'm talking about the companies that are doing good stuff like Suncor and CNRL, or not CNRL, Suncor and Conoco.
Conoco.
Conoco's doing good stuff. COSIA did come, so the guy named Dan Wicklum from COSIA went there. Like he went on his own, but so I mean, you got to think about that. And Alberta definitely has to think about that because I mean, frankly, the world is changing whether we like it or not, and so we need to think about what are we going to be doing, like 10, 20, not even like a 50 years in the future. I'm talking like 5 to 10 years in the future. Things are changing that fast.
Well, that's right. I mean, the things have basically changed in Alberta since 2015.
Completely. It's totally changed.
And a lot of those companies are still, well, you take a look at any of the political stuff going on in Alberta, see what people post online. Sometimes I see it on Twitter occasionally, and they all seem to think that once we get pipelines everywhere,
yeah,
what's going to happen is you'll get world price for oil and all that, and you might get closer to world price, but you're not contributing really in one sense. They don't seem to understand that Alberta is a price-taking province. We don't control the price of oil or any of these other things.
Yes.
And just because, as I said, I was offered that opportunity today, and I'm torn about it. I may need the money, but it was out of the blue too. Guy gave me a call today and wanted to know if I wanted to be an environmental inspector on that line, and I would rather go work in the cannabis industry.
It's interesting, and you're right though, because if you want to look at it from like a resilience standpoint, yeah, sure, you build pipelines, and of course there's going to be more activity and so forth, and people will do better in the short run. But how rigid is that? Like, what if we get another commodity dive? Another commodity dive in price? Then we're going to have a problem.
Yeah, no, that's right. So, and Jane just said, yeah, environmental inspection is important, and I actually agree with that. I just don't know if I want to step back into the oil patch after 30 years. So, and Jane, I do hold him to him. I'm the nastiest soil guy out there. I don't let him get rid of, I'd rather get thrown off the site and I have been in a couple occasions, objecting to certain practices. So, yeah, I do that, but my heart's not in it anymore. Yeah. And this stuff is really interesting, David. It really, really is. And then I can see how you've connected it to all these other things in the world, all these other things that are going on. So,
well, anyway. I think there's a lot of opportunity in Alberta for this stuff, to be honest with you. And this is why I tried so hard. I still have a lot of good colleagues and so forth in Alberta, and continue to talk to folks in Calgary Economic Development, and I believe that there's such tremendous expertise, like the depth of expertise of people like you, and then like all the other process engineers and so forth, that if repositioned can be like a huge asset to the country. You know what I mean? We just have to start to look at, I think, look at our business a bit differently. Like, yeah, I'm not saying abandon oil completely. Like, I mean, it's not what's going to happen. But I also think that there's a lot of opportunities in the global market where we could start to like look at what are these problems and how do we start to reorient some of our skills to address these problems, create new technology, create, market our services to these places, and then become like, we're then becoming the leaders in this change that is inevitable. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I agree. So it just, no, I'm not saying Alberta's evil or anything. I've been here for 40 years. I can't say that. It's been good to me. But I just see it sometimes that we seem to be, or people were stuck in this bubble.
Yeah.
And anything coming, for instance, ecological, environmental concerns coming out from, from outside that we're concerned. Like, people in Alberta do not understand that BC has different concerns about pipelines than Alberta does.
Oh, yeah.
But if you talk to somebody from here, the worldview says what we do here is good for everybody in Canada. So get on board. That's the deal. And it's very difficult to convince people sometimes that BC has different ideas, different concerns about it. And then I noticed somebody here the other day was talking about building an upgrade, finishing the Northwest Upgrader here and shipping, instead of dilbit, shipping processed material. So, it's Alberta's become it's a really weird situation here.
Yeah, I think if people don't understand what British Columbians' concerns are in Alberta about these pipelines, then they maybe need to talk to some people in BC, like, seriously, because it's there's such a dramatic. We understand. It's not like at least most people I know in British Columbia. And I'm like, I've worked in Alberta quite a bit, like, so and I've got a ton of friends there, so I'm not like anti-Alberta in any way, shape, or form. But if you talk to anybody who is born and bred in BC, particularly on the coast, about, their concern about the potential for a big oil spill or something like that, it's a legitimate concern, right? Because it's part of your culture, man. Like, this beautiful place is part of what you grew up with. And people need to understand that in Alberta. I think that would help the situation a bit, to say, hey, what if I were building some project that could impact something that's so valuable to these people, their landscapes and their nature, what they identify with. I think I kind of understand what their concerns are. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I do, and it's this battle of worldviews, right? And I've more than once mentioned that. And I was actually scheduled to work on Kinder Morgan as well, David.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to. Fortunately, the part I was going to be working on, running the environmental inspection crews, was from here to Jasper, not into BC. But I don't feel right about any of this anymore.
Yeah.
And I think and a lot of it is to do with the fact that seems to be a view that what's good for Alberta is good for BC, for Ontario, for the Maritimes, and that's not necessarily so. It's almost like there's this, in Alberta, any environmental concerns are being imported into the province, and we can't have that.
I think
because I end up talking to people, I say, BC, I say something simple like I just told you. BC has other concerns about the pipeline, and they're going to want answers and stuff, and they freak. I've had people tell me to, use 2 words at me. So, it's going to be a very difficult thing here in Alberta, and I'm pretty sure Kinder Morgan's a dead issue on June 1st anyway.
Yeah, it's a tough one, you know. I was on the fence about it because, I mean, I think of all the pipelines, Kinder Morgan, aside from the coastal zone issue, I mean, it's twinning a pipeline, right? So you're not, I mean, yes, you're having more impacts, but it's not like you're carving through pristine rainforest or something like that.
No, and they were going in the right in the original right of way, except for down by the coast in a couple spots, and that sort of thing.
But
But
I went to the protest, like I was doing some research at the protest a few weeks ago, or I guess more than that, 2 months ago. And when I went there, there's a lot of First Nations out. And when I saw that, I'm like, oh my God, like this is like the Mackenzie Valley Pipeline Part 2. That's exactly what I thought. I was like, this is like the Mackenzie Valley Pipeline where the Dene people are just like, this ain't going to happen. This will not happen. Our blood will run before this pipeline gets built. That's the feeling I got when I was there. And I believed him. Oh my God, this is a worldview issue. It's no longer, it's a worldview issue. And once it gets into something like that, especially when you look at because a lot of these things are working together. So like the worldview issue that is aligned with reconciliation processes in Canada, then you've got this like incredible, huge, hot political potato that people are trying to wrestle with. And it then develops a life that is so much bigger than just the environmental impacts of the pipeline and the economics of it, but it becomes like a philosophical issue. And that's how I think that's where we're at, I think, right now.
Yeah, well, there's a battle of ethical viewpoints or ethical worldviews, and your course here on sustainable development basically feeds right into it in a sense, because you have to look at, okay, if our solution is for our economy is just to build pipelines and pump oil out of Canada, we have a long-term problem.
Big time.
Because right now I have a friend who's in the Middle East working as a safety officer at a nuclear construction site that they're just wrapping up, and apparently there's 4 more. They've got 4 nuclear reactors. 4 more are going to be built by the Saudis right next to them.
Yeah.
So, I mean, and you know, oil is going to be around for another 50, 60 years, but, well, how many people have you said, I've said this and I've been told this, that, well, let's just cut off gas and oil to British Columbia, and you go, well, that's pretty stupid, you know. But I like this is really interesting stuff you do, David. Just fascinates me.
Cool. Well, I think the thing is, I like to remain positive about this, in the sense that there's many opportunities here, and my feeling is that once you start to kind of capitalize on those opportunities and demonstrate how it can work, and really show it, like, and this is where I think the whole idea of a design process, because design is not a theoretical thing necessarily. Design's an action word. As I said, it's a verb or a noun. Like, it's the noun in that I designed this. Here's my design. And the verb is the action of processing. So either way you cut it, it means you have to do something. So this is why I really like it, because we can talk all day about, like, oh, we need to do ecosystem service valuation, blah, blah, blah. But if you go and do it, and it works, and it's cool, and it makes sense, people will like it. Like, people will identify with it, as you can start to, like, you know, see how these kind of ideas can be manifested in sustainable solutions, both environmentally but economically as well. That's how I get people in Alberta interested in some of these ideas when I have talked to them, or like where we did this telespark design. We talked about, like, we didn't get all preachy about climate change, which one could. We were mostly focusing on where the future is going, and what the, you know, what are the ingredients that are in places like Calgary and Edmonton and elsewhere that can then feed into that future, because that's who our audience was children and youth for that project. Yep. So anyway, I don't know, I could go on, but I have to leave now, so I'm gonna have to cut it off. But thank you for coming out. It was great to chat with you, Adrian, and great to chat with the rest of you on. This is recorded, so the rest of the class can pick it up whenever they want. Adrian, I'll send you that email later on tonight with the semiotic stuff. And if anybody else has any questions, you can feel free to just email me, and I can answer them.
Okay.
Yeah, we had a nice chat tonight. It was cool. We're getting a little more like audience. I feel like Howard Stern, but for ecology. It's cool.
Yeah, no, it is. I'm really glad that you had sent you put these on Twitter, and that I can sign into, because I really enjoy them, and I didn't see them earlier, and otherwise I would have been here for all of them. So,
like I said, I just kind of didn't advertise much, but now I put it out on Twitter, and I send out an email, and I start to get more other people. And like I've got people from Facebook come on, and people from Montreal who I know. It's kind of fun. So. Yeah,
no, it is, and for me, it's really, it gives me some place to go. For instance, I've got quite a few books on landscape ecology. I'm kind of interested in it, but I'm interested in anything with land. I don't know why that is so, David, because land, how we use it, what it looks like, how it got there, fascinates me. So, anyway, thank you again for a wonderful lecture, and I'm sorry for monopolizing. So,
it was a pleasure. We'll see you next week.
Okay, thanks, David. Good night.
Take care.